Before we start this video, a large thank you to Binary Bird, Benjamin, Ben Who, Good Boy, Austin, Lord Ijet, Ben, and Caesar for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. And as always, an immense thank you to Halo Burner for the continued support of the channel this month on Patreon. It is sincerely appreciated, my friend, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Hello guys, alright, quick bug fix here before we start. So shout out to Preference pointing this out, thank you very much. So as you can see in our queue system, whenever we press the Q, it constantly turns the input to true. So let's follow this and see what happens. If we go to RB input and it's constantly being set to true, it's constantly setting to false, but then it's performing a weapon-based action or attempting to. Now there's nothing wrong with this inherently, but if we go here, you can see that every time we try this, we're actually sending a server RPC, causing us to send like 50 to 60 server RPCs across a couple of seconds. We don't want this. Now, this server RPC is ultimately pointless in the tutorial. It's not used. I put it here if you wanted to also sync the weapon actions across the server, but since we handle pretty much everything through animation events, we don't really need this, but I'm going to show you what it does before I show you how we can fix this, or if you want to keep it, we can change it. So I have a debug.log. You can see if I click it once, I'm sending a server RPC one time, but if I spam click the right bumper to queue it up, you can see 126 times here across a couple of actions it's trying to send. That's a lot of traffic on the network that does need to be sent. So what you want to do, how you fix it if you want to keep this here, you only want to send this server RPC after you pass all of the checks on the weapon action. So if you're the host also, or the owner of this player. So if you pass all the checks for the stamina and the stats, whatever, then you could send this RPC. But again, if you're doing it the way we are in this tutorial, you don't even need to send this RPC. This is just if you have some extra logic that needs to fire after you perform this weapon action on both ends. So I'm going to comment that for now because we don't need it. Now, also, a small little thing here, we're going to go to on current spell ID changed. Check for null before you sign to the inventory, or else you'll get an error when you join if there is no spell. Okay, that's it. Cool. So, one more. Process repost from server. Down here, you want to check if you're the owner before you play the action animation instantly, because basically this is going to run on both your object in your game and your object in everybody else's game. And if you're not the owner in everybody else's game, it's going to throw you a warning message. Not a big deal, but just so you don't see the warning message, put that there and check for the owner. Okay, cool. So, now, in this episode, we're going to make it so we have some warm-up effects, and we're going to make it so the projectile warms up in our hand, and then we throw a projectile in the game, and we're going to assign it some physics and make it move. So I'm just using the same particle effects as I used in a few videos ago, that cartoon effects remastered, because they're free mostly. I'm going to make this little fireball here, or I'm going to drag it into the scene rather. I'm going to set an audio source on it, change the spatial blend to 1 so it's 3D sound. I'm going to drag in an audio clip called Fire Impact and Play on Awake. That makes it so when this fireball is instantiated, you hear like a popping noise, which is what I want. And then I'm also going to drag a second audio source on it. I'm going to drag in a looping noise here. This is just going to play like a fire ambience while this game object is active. So you use any sound effects. You don't need to put them in right now. If you're just prototyping, don't worry about it. Just going to put it in to add some effect to our game. I'm going to make a folder inside the prefabs folder called spells. I'm going to make one for fireball. I'm going to drag this as a prefab in, original prefab. And then we're just going to right click and unpack it because we're going to use this to make another prefab for the actual projectile. So this is the warm up part. Basically, this is what spawns in your hand before you actually throw the spell. And now this next part will be when you actually release the spell. And this is going to have a rigid body and a collider, and it's going to move through the air. So I'm going to add a sphere collider to it. You can play around the radius. A lot of times you'll find that the particles don't exactly line up with the center point sometimes. In this case, they definitely don't. So what you can do also is, if you want to get a better view, you can click the isometric view versus perspective view, I believe it's called, here in the top right corner. And then you can align the particles. So just click this little square here like so. You can see this is kind of like a regular view. And if I click it right now, you get a much better view here for adjusting the collider. And I'm just going to make it so the collider is roughly around the fireball. There we go. Not going to spend too much time on this because I just want to get the logic out there right now. We can make it look pretty and make it perform better after it's been implemented. So just add a rigid body to that, and then we're all good to go from there. Next, I'm going to drag this down into the prefabs called Fireball Release. Now let's go to the Items and Scripts folder and make a new script for Fireball. I know I'm moving very fast because we do have a time constraint. I don't want to spend too much time on the little things, so feel free to slow this down or rewatch as you need to. Delete the start and update functionality as is per tradition. Drop in your namespace. Make the Fireball spell derive from spell item, and save that. Now we can go to the test spell we made. We can copy literally everything here, including the create asset menu name. Change test spell to fireball or whatever you're making. I'm just doing a generic projectile now, so you can kind of use this same logic with a lot of things. If it's projectile style, just tweak it a little bit. But each spell obviously is going to have its own little quirk, so you can't really make a one-size-fits-all for every spell in the game. If you did, it'd be probably pretty boring. So we're just going to delete all these debug messages here now. And now a small note too. I took this from Nephilim. We don't need an instantiate release and a successfully cast spell function. I have them Nephilim for a different reason. We just need one because they're basically the same thing. So I'm going to delete instantiate spell release, because what I'm trying to say is when you successfully cast the spell, you're releasing the spell anyway. So we don't need two of those there. I just had the extra functionality in Nephilim because I ran some logic after the spell had been cast. But we're going to keep it simple. No point in overcomplicating it. So I'm just going to delete the instantiate release off of everything and just keep the successfully cast spell. Keep in mind, if you're doing this too, just don't forget to change your animation events if you have any already. Otherwise, you'll get an error. You need to call this function now. Because I say that because I'm going to change the name of it to under the player combat manager from instantiate spell release to successfully cast spell. Okay, so now back over on the fireball spell, let's make a list of things we need to do so we have a good idea of where our head's at. So 1, determine which hand we place the warm-up effects in. Okay, so that's pretty simple. 2, we want to instantiate it at the proper location. What do I mean by this? Well, if you're using a staff in Elden Ring, I believe every staff has its own instantiation point for certain spells, usually on the top. If you're using a talisman or whatever it's called, the incantation just kind of comes into your hand. So we're going to make a system to basically know where to go when we instantiate a spell. And then 3, we're going to say right below instantiate it at a proper place, save the warm-up effects. So for example, let's say I'm casting Fireball and you hit me out of it before I successfully cast it. We need to delete that Fireball warm-up effect after you break my poise. So we need to save it somewhere as a local variable so we can delete it when we need to. Should you break out of that animation or should you finish the spell? And now down here on successfully cast spell, we need to make some comments here as well. 1, destroy any warm-up effects that we have when we successfully move to the cast. So destroy any remaining warm-up effects in the spell. Then we're going to say 2, get any colliders, so a list from our character. And we won't need this in this episode, but basically we want to get every possible collider on the player who's casting the spell. We want to make it so that the damage collider on the spell itself ignores any of these colliders, so you can't accidentally hit yourself as you're winding your arm back or something, because if the spell collider is quite large and it spawns in your hand, it's probably going to overlap with the colliders on your character. And then we need to instantiate the projectile itself. And then we need to apply damage to the damage collider and use the list of colliders here to ignore the damage collider after we spawn the projectile. I should probably put that up in the list, maybe 4 instead of 5. Not important right now though, just getting all of our thoughts in an order here. So we need to basically make it so the damage collider physics ignores any contact with our player, so we can't cast it on ourselves on accident. Alright, that's pretty much it, I believe. One more actually. Set the projectile's velocity. So, how it's going to move, basically, in this direction. Alright, cool. Let's start with instantiating a warm-up effect in the correct place. So this is going to be pretty simple. We're going to make an empty script. Oh, and also make sure you change instantiate to successfully cast spell. And I'm going to rename this too. This is in the player combat manager. You don't need to do this, but I just feel like that's better for the project. All right, so let's go to the utility scripts section and make a new C# script. Call it spell instantiation location. And then let's open this up, delete the start and update functionality, and drop in our namespace as is per tradition. And all we need to do really is just nothing. We just need to save this because we're just going to find it using the script. Now go to any of your charms, staves, or weapons. I'm going to use the unarmed section for this one and go to wherever you want it. So I'm going to put mine right on the weapon model section here and just add that script. That's it. Now you can give it a special transform if you want, but right now this is fine for what I need to do. So I'm just going to put it right there and save it. All right, cool. So we have a way now to locate this. Now save the warm-up effects variable. All right, cool. So let's go to the player effects manager and give this a local variable. And now that I'm thinking about it, we're definitely going to move this to the character effects manager because 9 times out of 10, you're going to have some kind of enemy in your game that's going to cast a spell and have to store its warm-up effects. So let's make a header for current active effects. I'm making this header generic because in the future we can include things like range projectiles or items that you're using, like you try to take a drink of your flask and whatever. Let's public game object active spell warm-up effects. Cool, very good. So now we have a place to store that. All right, it's looking good. Now let's start putting in some of this logic. So let's copy the using right hand and using left hand thing. So we can determine which hand we're using right now. Let's start with that, because this is going to in turn determine where we search for the place to instantiate the warm-up effects. So if we're using the right hand, the spell instantiation location, let's make a local variable for that. Let's call it spell instantiation location. You know what, since we're going to use this in both, let's put this above here, because we're going to find it in a different place depending on which hand we're using. And you could say equals null at start, but you don't really need to, because we're going to declare it either way. So if we're using the right hand, we're going to find this by going to the player, and then the player equipment manager, I believe it is. And then that's going to be the right weapon manager, then .get component in children, because the right weapon manager script, the manager script of the right weapon sits on the primary parent game object of the weapon model. And as you just seen a few moments ago, we put the spell instantiation location as a child of that. So there we go. And do the same thing for the left, except you search the left weapon manager. Okay, now, depending on what hand we're using, we're getting this either way. Next, let's make a game object variable for the instantiated spell warm-up effects. And just to show you, in case you forgot where these are, we can actually drag this outside too, because again, this variable is being created either way. We're just going to change where we put it, depending on where our spell instantiation location is. So let's instantiate the, what do we call it? Warm up, let me see, find it, spell cast warm up effects. And just to show you this variable, if you go to the base class, here it is. We have two game objects here. We have one for the warm up and the release. And this is on the spell item script. All right, cool. Now back up here. We don't need to assign a parent yet, but down here we're going to decide where the parent is. So in this case, the instantiated spell warm up effects transform.parent would be under the spell instantiation location .transform. And again, since this is true either way, we can put this on the bottom afterwards. We'll do that in a moment. We're also going to reset the transform by saying the transform.local position is equal to vector 3.0, and the transform.local rotation, don't forget that keyword there, local, is equal to quaternion.identity, and all this does is it zeroes out the rotation and the position when you reparent it under your new location. And since this is going to happen either way, we can just put this right below down here, and this as well. All right, cool. Now that should be working for the test in game. Let's keep going before we do that. Let's save this, and let's say player.playerEffectsManager.active spell warm-up effects is now equal to the instantiated effects we just created. All right, cool. Pretty straightforward. Now, how do we get rid of that in the event that we get hit? Well, there's a couple things we got to do for our, I'll say insurance to make sure it goes away either way. First, let's just resort our comments here so all this is pretty clear. There we go. I'm going to keep the comments here because I like them. Okay, let's go to the reset action flag here now. And the first thing we're going to do is what I said earlier. We're going to move this from the player effects manager to the character effects manager so it can be accessed in the future by the AI as well, because no doubt you're probably going to do this. I know I do for sure in Nephilim. All right, cool. Now let's save that. Let's go over to the reset action flag. And what we're going to do right now is we're going to delete this if it's not null. In the future, we can make a generic function to delete all of them, because you'll probably have a bunch, potentially like, you know, projectiles, items that you're using. But for now, we can just do a check. If the character.characterEffectsManager.active spell warm-up effects is not equal null, then destroy those warm-up effects. So remember, this gets called every time you're done in action. So this makes it so if something happens and this is still here during the end of your action, for whatever reason, it gets deleted. It's like an insurance policy. But it should never get to that point, because if you get broken out of it via a damage animation, we're going to do something different. Let's go to your take damage effect script. Now, right here where we have play directional based damage animation, see this? We are returning for the owner because we're just playing animations here, but right where it says if we are poise broken, we play our damage animation, this is where we want to delete this warm-up effects via a ServerRPC. So we're deleting it locally and on our player for everybody else. So let's just make a name for this now. Character.character, I'm going to use Combat Manager actually, because that would be a better place to do it. Character.character combat manager, and I'm going to call this cancel all actions. Yeah, so that would be like if you're drinking or trying to cast a spell or trying to draw an arrow, you know, you're canceling that. So I'm going to say cancel all attempted actions. I'm probably going to change that name in a moment actually, but for now that's fine. Let's just work with this for now and get the logic out. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to make a function on the character combat manager, and this function is going to call a server RPC. That server RPC is going to ping the server And then it's going to go to our player on everybody's game and delete any warm-up effects we have for our spells. And in the future, for drinking from a flask and for drawing an arrow, etc., etc. But for now, let's just say character.character-network-manager, and then we can copy this name. Again, I'm probably going to change that. And then use the end of the name ServerRPC. Now let's jump over to the character network manager. Let's go ahead and make that. What we're going to do now is put it right at the top here for now. I can make a little comment here too so it's clear. Used to cancel, hit tab here, there we go. Used to cancel effects, and then you can put when poise is broken. That's pretty clear. All right, let's drop in the public void. You make sure you're using the ServerRPC header thing, whatever you call this, and make sure it ends with ServerRPC. And then we're just going to do a check. If for the server, we're going to call upon this client RPC, which we're going to make by copying and pasting the function and changing server to client. So if is server, All right, change this to client. Now, all we do is do the same thing we did inside the reset action flag. Just check to see if that effects is not null, and if it's not, we're going to delete it or destroy it. Now, optionally too, if you don't like destroying stuff all the time, if you're playing a game where it's very simple and you don't have a lot of different spells, you could simply kind of disable it and re-enable it as you need it. But since a game like this would have lots of different kinds of warm-up spells, we're just going to delete it. All right. I'm going to make sure that, yeah, okay, that's good. And we're going to scroll up here so you can see we're not the owner here. We don't run this. This is why we're doing it from a ServerRPC if we are the owner. All right, cool. Let's jump back into the project. Go to data, go to items, go to spells. Let's create our new spell. And let's go ahead and we can copy everything from the test spell if you guys set that up too. Just all of the animations, I mean. But the new warm-up effects and the release effects, we have to search the prefabs we just made just now. So let's get Fireball release. And again, don't worry about making this pretty right now. Let's make it functional first, and then we can spend some time making it look nice, because right now it's going to look pretty terrible. The particle effects are probably not going to look that good, but we can spend that time making it look nice after the functionality is actually working. All right, there we go. Animations are in, and I don't need to put in my warm-up or release sound effects because I have those on the prefabs, but if you want to put additional sounds in there as well and call those when you cast a spell, that's cool as well. I'm going to use the Fireball spell here, put it into our item database, and there we go. I can throw it, and there you go. Boom, it deletes after it goes back to the empty state. Cool. So far so good, it's working. Now let's handle the second part. Also, don't forget to put that spell in your world item database or you won't be able to use it. Let's handle the part where we actually make the release particles instantiate and actually move across the screen somewhere. So let's call this player.player combat manager cancel all attempted actions. This is just going to delete the warm-up effects when we get to this portion. And then we're going to get the list of colliders of the player by getting an array of all of them in the children object of the player and also any colliders on the player. We're going to check to see if we're the owner before we do cancel all attempted actions in case you're running this action through some kind of ServerRPC. And now I'm going to rename this because I really don't like the name. I'm going to call it Destroy All Current Action Effects. That sounds way more straightforward and to the point. So just give me a sec here while I rename this literally everywhere because that name was kind of driving me nuts. Okay, cool. And I'm going to do the same thing as well on the Character Network Manager. Both the client and the ServerRPC names. Just going to quickly change those real fast. Much better. Okay, now I'm happy with that. Okay, let's go over now and copy the hand search so we know where to instantiate the projectile because it's going to work, guess what, the exact same way. We check for the hand once again because we're using the left or right hand. It's going to toggle that until the action is finished when we actually instantiate the spell, or rather cast the spell, sorry. So instead of instantiating the warm-up effects now, though, we instantiate the release effects like so. We can change this variable name to instantiated release spell effects or whatever you prefer, whatever makes the most sense to you, just call it that. As long as you know that this is the effects that will be instantiated when you're actually casting the projectile of the spell. All right, cool. Now, it is much the same. You can zero out the location again if you want and parent it, but you have to unparent it this time because otherwise when you actually apply velocity, it's going to behave rather weird if it's parented to your hand and you start moving around. So we want to parent it, zero out the transform and the rotation, so it is perfectly at the casting point, and then unparent it after. And we don't have any damage collider yet, so we can't make our damage collider ignore collisions with the player, so don't worry about that for now. And I'm also going to adjust these numbers here because this should probably be done in this order. So there we go. All right, cool. Now set the project's velocity and direction. To do, make the projectiles up and down direction get chosen depending on where the player is looking. So in Elden Ring, you can look up and down, and if you're looking up, you'll kind of free aim the projectile up. Same with down, you'll do it down. Have that set up in Nephilim, but that warrants a video all on its own because it also works the same way for range and even melee attacks. So that's going to be covered separately for all forms of combat, should I cover that in the future. So we're going to check first if we are locked on. We want to make the projectile look at the lock-on target by it saying instantiated release spell effects.transform.lookat player.player combat manager.current target.transform.position. Otherwise, we're just going to look forward or in the direction that you're casting. So we'll do that in a second. Let's also make a local rigid body variable, spell rigid body, is equal to instantiated spell effects get component rigid body. Now, here's where we can apply our velocity. So a fireball kind of has a little bit of upward velocity at first, just a little bit, and then it has some forward velocity. So let's make a vector 3 for upward velocity, and we can say that's equal to, let's reference the instantiated spell effects, and then we can times its upward direction by 7, and we'll say the forward direction by about 25. Probably going to change this. This might be a little bit too powerful. I think in Nephilim I might use this though. I can't remember for sure. So we'll say instantiated spell release effects.transform.up times 7, and then we'll do the same thing with times 4 by 25. Now, we're not going to keep this with magic numbers. We're going to make this a variable so you can tweak it, because I never like to use magic numbers. You should never use magic numbers. You can make it a variable, definitely go for it. I mean, there are some situations where it probably isn't necessary, but it's definitely necessary in this situation to tweak it. So then we're going to get the total velocity by combining the upward velocity with the forward velocity by saying upward velocity plus forward velocity, and then we apply that velocity to the rigid body by simply saying spell rigid body.velocity is equal to the total velocity, and that's it. All right, let's save that, and I am going to unparent this from the hand because I forgot to. So instantiated spell release effects.transform.parent is equal to null, and I also should probably do this after I'm actually setting the velocity and stuff. So if I go in here now and try to warm this up and fire it, it rolls on the ground and goes in a very weird direction. So let's go and do a couple things here before we get around to why that's happening. Let's make a new layer. Let's call this projectile brackets pass through character or object. Sorry, it will be character. Now you're thinking, why are we going to pass through a character, Seb? I want you to trust me on this one because the projectile itself isn't what hits the character, it's the damage collider. See, let's make this so it only collides with the default layer, that's our ground, and our projectiles itself. So what's going to happen is, if you make this collide with the character, then as soon as it touches the character on the outer edges, it's going to pop when it shouldn't pop that early. Also make sure this is after you set the look at target with lock on. To make it look forward, we're going to say vector 3 forward direction is equal to player.transform.forward, and then we're going to apply the forward direction by saying instantiated release spell effects.transform.forward is equal to forward direction. So yeah, so as I was saying, if it pops early, it looks kind of silly, but if the fireball gets part way into the target before it pops, it looks way better. So we're going to make it so the damage collider is what pops. There we go. Throwing is working. If I lock on now, it should fire at this character. And yes, it does. Okay, cool. So we're going to need to tweak that for sure, but it's definitely working out well so far. I will elaborate more on my comment in just a moment. Actually, we'll come back to this whole damage collider being its own thing and spell kind of half going into the character. Let's make two local variables here for the upward velocity and the forward velocity. And let's actually apply those local variables instead of using magic numbers. I'm going to say 3 and 15. And I'll make a header here for projectile velocity. And I will come back to my thought after we have this logic implemented so I can talk about it more clearly. Let's say transform.up is multiplied by the upward velocity and transform.forward is multiplied by the forward velocity, and it's complaining because we have two variables named the same thing. So let's name these local vector 3 variables, not upward velocity, but up velocity. Actually, I don't like that. Let's call it upward velocity vector and forward velocity vector. That sounds much better. And then we're good to go. And then Unity, or rather Visual Studio, should stop complaining. Change this to forward velocity. Yes, and it is still throwing me an error. Whoops, that's why. Now, make the total velocity equal to the upward velocity vector and the forward velocity vector. and save this. All right, cool. So back to my thought. Now, here's why you want the projectile itself to not actually collide with the player. So I tested this in Nephilim quite extensively, and I found that specifically with a lightning spear, for example. Now, I want you to visualize this in your head. Picture a lightning spear, right? So it is a spear projectile. If the actual collider with the rigid body was treated as the same collider with the damaged collider, then what would happen is as soon as the tip of that spear hits a target, the whole spear would explode. And that doesn't look really cool, because what you want to happen is you want the projectile to actually go into the character a little bit before it explodes. So, imagine, if you will, to a fireball. Take a perfect circle in your head and pretend the circle is being thrown at somebody. Imagine if as soon as the edge of the radius of that circle hit the target, the whole circle disappeared and exploded. Not as cool as, say, the circle going into the target and, say, a third or even half of the circle getting into the target before it explodes. That's why we have two colliders. We have the collider that makes the projectile travel, that ignores players, but will not ignore something like the map. And then we have the damage collider, which is smaller than the actual travel collider, that will actually allow the projectile to look like it's going into the target before exploding. This, in my opinion, looks so much nicer, and it has a way nicer effect. So in the next video, I'm going to show you how to set that up. We're also going to set up damage, and we're going to get around to setting up the focus point system as well. So thank you all for joining me again this weekend, guys. I hope you all had a very, very lovely week, and I hope you have a very lovely weekend. If you didn't know, our game now, Nephilim, has a Steam store page, so if you guys want to check that out and drop me a wish list, that would be very much appreciated. Thank you all for being here, and as always, a special and thank you to my patrons. It is because of each and every one of you I get to keep doing this, and I love doing this, so you have my sincerest gratitude. I will see you guys next week.